Now we got to deal with teams, because in product development, we are never working alone. There is no such thing as getting something out of the door all by yourself. Back in the 60s, 70s was kind of the last days of the garage inventors. And, you know, we're, especially as we're talking about technology that's bringing more and more humans into the interaction. It's not algorithms anymore. It's not green screens. It's not filling out forms. We are having to care about the human interaction with the product. And in the end, if the team doesn't internalize this data, and if the team doesn't have a shared understanding of what's going on, it's going to be a problem. Okay. So as soon as I started working at Digital Equipment, I was working alone. And then I had this profound experience of going in to work with this one, was the Eve team. And we gathered data on version 1, and they were freaking out, jumping on tables. Remember, this is all male development. They were like, I don't want to know something isn't working. We already have version 2. So what we have to realize is we can have whatever ideas we want in UX, but if we don't get it into the minds of the team, and if the it isn't part of their, if you would, inner gut feel, we're in trouble. So what are we really talking about? First and foremost, I found that if that team didn't have a shared understanding, both of the data, what it meant from a market perspective, and why we are pushing the design in a direction, you're going to produce nothing. And I would go into the room and, you know, big talk or something and say, hey, I want to use this with your team. Now, you have to know how to talk to them. And so one of the things I learned is that, well, all the products were late. They're always late. And so I just, you know, they'd say to me, why does your process work? Did you measure it? And I would say, do you measure your current process? And then they would laugh. And I would say, so how many of you are still fighting with each other about what features to put in until 2 weeks, 1 week before you're supposed to ship? And then they all start laughing. And then they listen. If we don't uncover the problem so they can see it, then they're hearing nothing. They're going to fight with you about science. I never fight back about science. I tell stories. But the products were late. And so what are we going to do? We got to have a shared understanding. And in addition to that, none of them can agree because they're all designing from the eye. They are saying, I like this and I like that, and this is what I think we should ship based on themselves. We still have a lot of design from the eye today because people go home, they talk to their grandkids and their kids, and they say, oh, my kid likes this, so let's do that. We're still doing it for personal experience. It's not our market. So that was another challenge, right? And, you know, we learned because we tried it. We gave slideshows and talks about the user data, but it didn't really matter because everybody stops listening and there's no face validity. Why should they listen? Then we're in a war. And I used to say to the user people, I'm like, yeah, you can't bang them over the head. You cannot be an evangelist. It turns them off. And then we have to deal with the fact that, you know, if we're interpreting the data or saying something about it, everybody starts riffing off of it, or they'd start arguing over terms. There'd be interaction chaos. So in the end, if we were going to interpret that data, the situation itself, the overall situation we found ourselves in challenged the way we took the observations in the interview and turned them into something shareable. So, you know, back in the day, when I was doing my thesis, I would have 3 buffers up. It would be the transcript, it would be my insights as I went along, it would be high-level themes. Yeah, when we did that all alone, nobody would listen. So we started trying to do it in a team. And that's where the Post-its came in. We started writing things on Post-its. The interpretation session evolved through iterations with real team members in order to immerse them in the data so that they started to have a sense of ownership. Immersion is one of our principles of impacting, changing teams and moving them in the direction of data, Okay, now let's look at the interpretation session itself as it evolved. We capture key notes. These key notes will become part of the affinity diagram. We also model the data. All of this data will be consolidated into a market view. But how did we run it? At the time, John Whiteside and the Sue group were studying meeting methods because part of what they thought was that people would interact better if they used better meeting techniques. The idea of what's a good meeting technique is long history, and the fact that people won't use good meeting techniques is also long history. Now, the interesting piece, if we look at the evolution of methods, is that we are finally, now we have a method with massively high structure that people accept. Agile has massively high structure that conforms to the elements of a well-defined structured meeting. And that is what we started. I mean, we did that because that is what worked to get a shared understanding in the interpretation session. What does that mean? Everybody knows their job. We have a good focus on what is going on. There's multiple roles. There's a central artifact that Lucy Suchman taught us was needed if we wanted a focal point and we could all see what was happening. There were criteria of goodness for what you could write down and not write down, and there were rules of how to interact. All these things create a shared understanding that then has more reliable data that can be put together for a market view. In the end, if we don't involve people in the data, manipulating it in one form or another, they don't internalize, they don't use it. All right, but now let's think a little bit about where did the interpretation session come from? And then, because in the beginning there were no models, there were just notes. And then where did the affinity diagram come from? Like how did we get that idea for the affinity diagram? Okay, well, the job that I got at Digital Equipment Corporation was in the quality group. And Lou Cohn, my manager, was really keen on all the quality processes. We went to see Deming speak one of the last times he spoke. He's very impactful about how to change organizations. So here I am, steeped in an organization, talking about how to change organizations, how to get better products, and what processes they use. So let's think about this. I started by having people with physical post-its sitting around writing. That became chaotic because who was going to take notes when? We couldn't see each other's notes. The meeting rules, it was not going by the meeting rules. So where am I going to get this idea? All right, now, what you see on the left is called a QFD. A QFD is one of the quality tools that Deming created. Now, do understand that Deming was not, it was primarily for machine design, automobiles, etc. And Deming was not accepted in the United States because the practices are very detailed. And, it was accepted in Japan, right? But in many ways, we, and certainly software developers, do not have the temperament for, filling in a bunch of boxes in a meeting. So across the top here are the engineering metrics, which somebody would have to define. And along the side are the customer requirements. And Lou Cohn was very excited about contextual inquiry because he wanted some kind of a more systematic way to get this stuff on the side, right? Right here. That is the stuff that really is influencing me because I knew right away I was never going to get anybody that I was working with to sit through filling out all these boxes and numbers. It was never going to happen. So I was driven now to find a methodology of how to capture the data, how to organize it so I could see the trends, right? And how to manage the people so it would really happen. Again, I'm thinking immersion, shared understanding, and also how to keep people engaged because otherwise, that was the problem. Everyone said, well, no one will use these quality processes. Yeah, well, no one will use the quality processes. If they won't use them, you can't use them. All right, now what did we do with this side stuff? Where did that come from? Well, the way you got that left column in QFD is you were in a room with a bunch of people and everyone would go around and they would write an observation on a Post-it. Then they would take these Post-its and we would stick them up on the wall And an affinity diagram at the time was one of the 7 new tools. And then we would, in a bottoms-up process, look for the themes and the collections. This was with about 100, maybe 200 post-its. The number of observations we would have from a set of people that we might interview in the field could be anywhere from 600 and upwards to 2,000 post-its. So we couldn't use the technique as is, but now we could start iterating it. And so we turned that into the affinity diagramming process that you see today. And we had to change it. But the first thing we had to do is say, hey, people are not used to inductive reasoning in bottoms-up thinking to find themes. They just aren't. They don't know how to do it. They sure don't know how to do it about behavior and experience when what they are is engineers. And so if everything's written on a Post-it, and in the day it was literally writing on a Post-it, and we had evolved the interpretation session so that it worked, and we started projecting the single artifact everyone could see. We started capturing it digitally, printing it on physical Post-its. If everyone had a physical piece of data, they had to read it. They're again immersed in it, and building it is another immersion process. And we taught them to think bottoms up and to find themes, or if you'll remember back, frameworks of understanding. The simple act of manipulating the data and seeing the eventual result, which now is an organized hierarchy of what's going on with the user, not what the user needs, which is a design idea, but what they do and what they feel. This is what we were representing. So now we had this great tool that people could walk. We could put design ideas right on the data so that the data itself was driving design instead of everyone looking at the sky and saying, what would be a good idea? By immersion in the interview, in the interpretation session, in building the data, and then in walking the data. By the time they get to new product concepts, the data has been internalized and changed the design from the eye. So the affinity diagram and walking data with design ideas addresses another big problem we had, which is how do we get them to think about design ideas that are relevant to the data? Well, we had already learned a few things. Anytime you try to run some kind of brainstorming with no data, you get utter chaos and crazy, oh my God. And then if you go straight from the data to design, oh, they might design from one person's idea instead of the whole market. You needed a market view, and or it would be worse. It would be chaotic, people talking over each other. So we knew, all right, first we have to get them steeped, and then we're going to talk a little bit later about product ideation. Now, so we knew that we had to work in a team if we wanted a shared understanding, and we knew that whatever we did, it had to be fast. They had to be able to do it. Otherwise, they have no, we abandoned transcribing tapes and videos long ago, because by the time you got to, it was way too much detail. And in the interpretation session, we would recover the primary things if we did it 24 hours, 48 hours right after the fact, because no engineer, no developer is going to deal with the data. And if all it produces is a UX report, well, no one's going to listen because they space out in the room. So remember, we're trying to get it into them. So at 2 in the morning, they can make that decision. All right. Now, the next thing I want you to notice as one of the techniques to getting it into them is an affinity diagram looks like a hierarchy. Every developer on the face of the earth knows what a hierarchy is. All of our user interfaces look like hierarchies. The database was formed as a hierarchy. The UI, the initial UIs looked like, oh, here's one of the, data nodes. Here's another. We called those menus. Your drop downs was what was under it. In fact, we had to stop them from thinking about hierarchies to get decent UIs, but a hierarchy is a good way to pull them in. They're not going to be lost in a hierarchy. And if we build it all together, everybody gets their ideas in it, and it's fast. In other words, we could build this kind of affinity in a day. So remember, People talk about time, but they never mean man hours. Never talk about man hours. You talk about elapsed time. And so my smart people I was working with would, because now we're doing consulting as well, they would invite their teams, they would have pizza, they would have games, they would get everybody in to build the affinity. And the whole thing would be done. So it felt like, oh, that was fast. I could take a day. We don't have to count that there were 10 people in the room. We don't care. All right, so this idea, two ideas. One, using something familiar and then twisting it once you get it from some origin. And then the second, you got to pull them in. If you don't pull them in, you're dead in the water. Okay. So what are we saying? Another principle, build on what they already know, a hierarchy. Oh, well, we did that because we had another problem. What was our other problem? We wanted engineers to think about psychology. We wanted them to think about human behavior and experience. They don't know anything about any of that stuff. Not at all. We were not sending them to get a degree, and we were not only going to work with anthropologists because then it's not in the guts of the product managers and the engineers. So how do we get a way of thinking about data? How do we get them thinking about people in a way that will resonate with them? Well, one of the things engineers knew was about modeling. And you'll see that contextual design, both in the first book and the later book, as the models evolve, have a whole set of models. When I first tried to teach engineers in the first evolution of the CI/CD course, I tried to tell them what to collect, and they could not relate to it. They couldn't remember it. But it turned out that when I was talking to teams in the room, capturing the data in an interpretation session, I would also naturally jump up to the whiteboard, or it could have been a chalkboard, I don't even remember, and I'd start drawing pictures. I ended up drawing pictures to help me remember what was going on. Well, so when we said, what should we do? We said, well, why don't we just turn those pictures, Karen, that you were always drawing, systematize them, and then we'll give them models. I mean, certainly they could understand the sequence diagram because that's just a task, step, 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 step. They could understand an artifact because that's a thing. What about the rest of the stuff? And so we had secrets. They sure knew about data flow diagrams. How do we represent people interacting and the roles they play? Hey, does that look familiar? Does that look familiar? That's a flow model. That's the flow model that was in the first book, and it looks a little bit like a data flow diagram. But we say, you represent the insides of the system. Let's use that idea to represent human behavior and experience. And so models were born because engineers understood models. And when we faced the question of how do we represent the system from the person's point of view, how do we keep the system coherent? How do we make sure that when they're thinking about things, they don't think in hierarchies of the database coming up. They think about what the user, the coherent activity of a user in what we now had screens, in each screen. And what came into being, that's a system architecture underneath. This is a high-level view of user environment diagram, which is talking about how a user is in each of these places. What is the functions under these places? How do they move? Now we're talking navigation from place to place to keep the UI coherent. So we take what they know and we twist it. And similarly, when we tried to get them to do redesigned sequence models, that didn't work because it was textual. So we borrowed from filmmaking, and that's where storyboards came from in our process. So the other thing you can see is the different pieces of CD came in at different times. The order changed. At first, it was just go to the field and, interpret the data, but maybe not build it. Somewhere along the line, I had met Pella N and Kim Madsen from Aarhus University and learned about paper mock-ups and taken those into the field. And I was like, yeah, that's good. Let's just do that too. So eventually that stayed, but we had to do some other things to keep things coherent and still using and pushing the data along the way. So what are we saying when we design things? Steal and twist, and then evolve them. As the team and the tech and the methodologies and evolve, you have to reinvent and iterate with real teams. You don't sit around in a room thinking what they should do. You're not going to get anything anyone is going to be willing to do. And that is what happened when the whole configuration of our field changed, because eventually it wasn't all engineers. Eventually it wasn't engineering product managers. Now we still have a lot of that, but we started to have real user researchers. We started to have university programs. We started to have design. Oh my God, what's that, right? We started to have completely different ways. We started working with, when we worked with companies, we had to work with librarians, we had to work with nurses, we worked with domain specialists, we worked with people who knew nothing about psychology and nothing about engineering. And then we wanted them to walk the walk. Well, everyone can use the affinity. Everybody gets that. But if we want to keep the practice coherent, what we were finding is that the models that we had, they were great for engineers, but they weren't as good for, if you would, more regular people, okay? And so eventually we were also looking to see that the way people interacted with each other was changing, particularly when real mobility, iPhone, Samsung, all the rest of it came out. The whole practice changed. So we ran What Makes Things Cool project, and that led to an evolution in the models themselves. You can see that they're more colorful, they're more story-based. We even, when we created them, we tested them as they were evolving with teams we were working with. And our metric was how many design ideas did they collect in the wall walk? Well, if they didn't collect design ideas, we had to change them. And when we wanted to do, we were working with cars and machinery at the time. We wanted to deal with the fact that they had to do, kind of a, not visual design so much as the, I'm blanking on the word, at the industrial design, right? Making it beautiful. So we collaborated on that sensation board. We invented that with our GM, General Motors team. All of the things we're doing to make sure that people will use it, and it's representing the evolution, including the evolution of how to use the data to drive into the different methodologies, including Agile, okay? So what we're learning is that we are committed to getting the best data. But if we want that data used, if it doesn't get into the mind and the practices of the team, nothing happens. Every other step in contextual design is about managing the team. If you do not manage the team, I don't mean manipulate the team. I mean involve the team, deal with their idiosyncrasies, make them powerful to learn how to do this practice. Make sure that everybody participates. People often want to change methodologies when they don't like it. They think they don't like it. Adults get overwhelmed if they don't know what to do. Adults go, I don't know what to do. People respond, for example, very differently to the affinity diagram. Some people are overwhelmed by a million post-its. Some people can put them up like this without label. Some people excel at labeling. Some people know how to structure. Some people, once it's got a preliminary structure, can really do it well. If we responded to each one of those individuals and said, I'm going to change the process because this one person doesn't like it this way. So we don't do that. We want the team brain. We want the whole brain. And we had to develop ways of making sure that they understood they wouldn't know what to do in the beginning. We had to help them to accept that they'd get better over time and they'd have different skills. Everyone loves the affinity diagram. And we would say, trust the process. Because if you structure that process enough, everyone can do it because you are guiding them each step of the way. For adults to accept anything, they need to feel competent, and they need to feel competent fast. Otherwise, they're going to talk methodology all day long and fight about it, and nothing will get done. All right. So how do we do it? It's a sneak attack. I'm big on sneak attacks. If you read my book on retaining women in tech, first we get the data. We figure out how to turn that data into something that represents the market, and we make sure that the team is immersed every step of the way. But then if we want to create practices that work, we have to find one, we have to twist it, we have to iterate it, and we have to make sure it works, like the ones that I've been sharing with you today. And then last, we have to know what the team will tolerate. It does not matter if something is an nth degree better, if only you would. If no one will do it with you, it does not matter. And I cannot emphasize more the need for each one of the working meetings to be structured, to have a goal, to have a practice that can be followed, to have facilitation, etc. And if we look at what's happening with remote work today, if you do not have structure in your group meetings, you're dead in the water.